What's up guys, welcome back to the channel and to another weekly 3D model. This week we're going to be making an old USSR Iron. I saw this image online and I thought it'd be a great model to create a video showing the full step-by-step process from beginning to end. It's a beginner-friendly model and I love texturing things with a lot of wear and tear, so this one looked like fun to recreate. So let's get started. So there's a lot of factors that come into play when you're trying to decide how you're going to create your game asset. One of the most important is the size of the textures and how many textures you use. Now for something like this, a little iron, we're only going to use one texture map. Now when it comes to poly count, it really depends on what engine and platform the model will be used in and how that model is going to be used. For example, a prop in a mobile game would have to be less polys than a prop used in Unreal Engine 5. And a prop for a main character versus something that's in the background and that's barely in view. I thought somewhere around 4,000 would be fitting, mostly because I wanted to have some nice close-up renders. But when we add our core later on, it went well above that target, so at the end of the modeling I'm going to go through a few variations of chords depending on if you needed to save on polys or not. So for now, let's just block everything out and we can start with the main iron shape itself. So all I did here was start off with a cube and started scaling that cube out, adding a few edge loops just so I can start blocking out that iron shape. So let's just play around with the shape a little bit. Alright, so now that that shape is roughly blocked out, I'm just going to merge together using the target weld tool these front points and vertices. That way I can add my own bevel to it and I can have more control over how big that bevel is. For the sake of the model and keeping those polys relatively low, I'm not going to bevel every edge. Now I still want it to look realistic, so for those bevels I do create, I want to make sure to keep those segments relatively low. So let's start rounding out some of these corners and we can finish up this main iron shape. Now this old USSR Iron I was using as a reference had a rounded out back end, a little bit more than this, so we're just going to move around some of these polys just to play around with the shape a little bit to make it a little bit more rounded. Now if you were aiming to have a really low poly iron, obviously you don't have to add all these bevels on these edges, but just so I can have some nicer close-up renders, I'm just going to bevel out these a little bit. Alright, cool, so all of our bevels are finished. Now let's just play around with the shape a little bit more and then we can move on to all the other objects. Alright, so next up was creating that little metal piece that holds that wooden handle. So all we're going to do is start off with the cube, scale that nice and small, and I can start blocking out that shape. All I'm really going to do is just delete one of these end faces and I can start extruding it out to give it a little bit of a curve. And then for the top, it's the exact same thing. I'm just going to delete that face, extrude it, and then bevel out the edges to round it out. And once I'm happy with the one side, all I have to do is duplicate it, spin it around to create the other, and then I can reattach it together. Alright, so next up was creating that little wooden handle. And that's pretty straightforward. All I have to do is just create a cylinder and scale that nice and small to fit in between those two metal pieces we created. And once that's fitting in place, I can go ahead and give a small bevel to those outside edges. So in my reference, the handle had a little bit more of a shape to it. So all we're going to do is add 3 extra edge loops, and I can scale in those 2 outside edges just to give it a little bit of a wave pattern. And then all I have to do is just give those 3 edges a small bevel. And just like that, our handle is finished. So let's go ahead and just play around with this shape a tiny bit more, and then we can move on to that metal piece that's holding that back wire. Alright, so next up is working on that back metal piece that holds that wire. So very similar to how we did the other metal piece that holds this wooden handle, we're going to do the exact same process. So we're going to select the cube, scale that nice and small. I can delete those faces, I can start extruding those edges. The only difference with this shape is that every side is basically extruding outwards. Now we're just going to focus on one side of the shape just to make our life a little bit easier, and then once I'm happy with it, I can chop it in half and then flip it over to create the other side. So we're just going to take our time and slowly start blocking this shape out. Alright, and just like I mentioned earlier, we're only working on one side to make our life a little bit easier, so once I'm happy with the shape, I'm going to add one edge loop directly in the middle, and then I can just chop off the other side. All I have to do is go over to Edit, Duplicate Special, and just duplicate it along that X-axis so it flips over to the other side. And then I just take these two shapes, combine them back together, select those two edges, and re-bridge them so they connect. Alright, so next up is creating that little metal bar that's on the back. So to do that, I'm going to use an EP curve tool so I can start drawing out all those points. Now I'm just going to focus on one side, and then once I'm happy with that shape, just similar to how we did that last object, we can just flip it over and reattach it. So I just really quickly drew some points, and I'm not going to worry too much about that shape because I can always adjust it once I get it into position. So let's start scaling this to fit a little bit closer to the area we need it to go, and then I can start dragging around these points to get them in the positions that I need. And once I'm happy with the shape, I can select it, go up to create, and turn that into a sweet mesh. And then at this point, it's just a matter of changing that scale profile to figure out how thick I want that piece of metal to be, and drag up that precision to add more polys to the shape. And this is really important depending on how many polys you want to have on the shape. So if you crank that slider all the way to the top, you're going to have a lot of unnecessary polys. So play around with the slider depending on how you want the shape to look. And what I like to do if you're trying to aim for a lower poly shape is you can go in afterwards and manually click all those edges around the bends that are pretty sharp, and you can just add its own bevel to those depending on how rounded you want them to be. And once you're happy with it, you can go back up to Edit, Duplicate Special so we can flip it over to the other side, and similar to how we did the other one, select them both, combine them, double click those edges, and bridge them back together. So onto that little metal piece that actually holds that metal bar onto the iron, we're going to go ahead and create a cube, scale that nice and small, and start positioning that exactly where we need it. And once we're happy with where it is, I can go ahead, delete that side face, and start extruding that edge. And once again, I'm just working on one side, and once I'm happy with it, I can just duplicate it to create the other side. Alright, so while zooming out, I noticed on that back metal piece, we forgot to fill in those little faces on my cylinder. So I'm going to zoom in, double click that edge, extrude it, and merge it to the center, and I can re-double click that edge and give it a little bevel. And then all I have to do is just re-chop it in half, duplicate it, re-merge it, just like we did earlier. Now that we have that end piece nice and beveled, now the shape is looking correct. Alright, so next up is creating those little bolts that are holding that handle in place. So that's pretty straightforward. We're just going to create another cylinder. I'm going to bring in those subdivisions so it's only 6-sided, and then we can just position that into place. So I end up adding a few bevels to this bolt. Now this isn't completely necessary, and I probably wouldn't do this if I really was aiming for a low poly model. But in this case, since we want to have a few close-up renders, I thought adding a very small bevel would just help bring that realism, especially to these hard edges. I'm also going to add a very small cylinder that's on the inside, acting as that little piece that the bolts kind of screws onto. And once again, this is not necessary. I probably wouldn't even add this shape. You can get away with just adding this one cylinder we first added as the bolt. But just to add a little bit more detail, we're going to add a very small low poly cylinder that we're going to fit right in the middle of it. Alright, so next up was doing that long cord that's wrapped around the handle and hanging off the side. So similar to how we did that back metal piece, we're going to create another EP curve tool, and then I can roughly move those points into the positions that I need, and I can take this line and scale that nice and small and start moving these points all over my model. Now this is a little bit tedious and it takes a little bit of time, so I'm going to speed up this next part of the video as I just mess around with these vertices and move it around so it looks like it's a looping all the way around my handle. And I also wanted to mention how you're positioning these objects is important depending on how your model is going to be used. For example, if it's going into a mobile game and it needs to be really low in polys, having your cord wrap around the handle and hang off the side probably isn't necessary. And in that case, I would have a very low poly cylinder that's just going off the back and just kind of loops on the table, or even not adding a cord at all. So keep that in mind depending on how your model is going to be used. Really depends on how you create these shapes. Now in this case, my reference was showing it looping all the way around. It was a high poly model and I thought it looked really cool and I wanted to recreate that. So I'm going to create the higher poly one first just to show it looping around, and then later on we can reduce some polys to have a lower one, which I end up using in my renders. And then I also create a really low poly one just to show you how I would do it if I didn't want to have it looping all the way around the handle. So let's go ahead and start positioning all these points around my model, and then we can wrap up this cord. Now rather than making you watch me position all these points around, I'm just going to fast forward the video until I'm just finishing it all up. Alright, so now that that sweet mesh is created, I'm going to enter soft select mode by hitting B on my keyboard, and I can zoom in and start positioning this cord a little bit closer to my handle. Right now it's just hovering right above it, and rather than going back and editing my curve and then going back to redo my sweet mesh, I'm just going to go in with that soft select brush and I can get it a little bit closer to my model. Alright, so next up was creating that little end piece on my cord, the little plug that plugs into the wall. So to do that, I'm going to create a little cylinder and I'm going to position that on the end of my cord. So in my reference, it was showing it all rounded with some nice indents on the side, and I really liked the look, and I wanted to create something similar without creating all those polys. So I'm just going to delete those top faces so I can just fill in that hole so I have a face with no edges on it. And then I can go in with that multi-cut tool and just reconnect some of those points so I have a nice rectangular shape that's on top. Then all I have to do is just extrude that face upwards so I have those small indents without having all those polys. And then all I have to do is just bevel those outside edges just to round it out a tiny bit. And I'm also going in with my multi-cut tool and attaching these vertices just so I can have some four-sided faces, since we don't want any faces that are really more than four sides. And once again, you can get away with having a much lower poly shape. You could literally add a little cube and just fit that in on the end of the cord, and you probably wouldn't be able to tell depending on where your model is going to be used. So keep that in mind as well. So I decided to add a very tiny cylinder, just to position it right on the top of my plug where the cord actually goes into it, just to help make it a little bit more realistic. But this is definitely not necessary, and once again, I probably wouldn't add this if I was making a low poly model. Alright, so next we just have to create those little tiny metal pieces that sit in the plug itself. So once again, creating a very small cylinder, and we can position those right inside of the shape. Alright, so next up was creating that little metal coil that's on the back. It's basically holding that cord that goes right into the iron. So to do this, I'm going to go up to the Create tab, go down to Polygon Primitives, and create a helix. So I'm just going to go in and play around with some of these settings so I can have this coil positioned a little bit better so it can fit around my cord. Now obviously, depending on where your model is going to be used, a coil can quickly add a lot of polys to your scene. So this once again isn't necessary. If you were really having a lower poly model, I would add just a little cylinder shape to act as like a little extra rubber piece that sat around that end cord. In this case, I wanted to have that end wrapped coil piece like my reference photo. I thought it looked really cool. So we're just going to go in and edit some of these settings so it's a little bit lower in poly, and then we can position that right where we need it. Alright, so this little metal coil piece was bent a little bit to go in the position of my cord. So to do that, I'm going to go up to my Deform tab, go down to Nonlinear, and I can add a bend to this object. Then I just have to play with that curvature and the low and high bound depending on how you want to bend your shape. So I'm just going to go in and play with these settings a little bit so I can add a slight bend to it, and then we can position it right over our cord. Alright, so that's looking much better now, and on the very top of this coil there's this little plastic white piece, so we're just going to add another very small cylinder, and I can position that right on the top. And once again, just going to add a very tiny bevel to it. Alright, so just before we wrap up the model and jump into the UVing, I thought we would add a tiny little detail just before we finish everything off. And that's just some little extra screws. Now you can definitely get away with this in the texture, and it's definitely not necessary in your model. So I would suggest not adding these if you're really aiming for a lower poly model. For example, I add an extra 500 polys to my scene just by adding a few little half cylinders. So once again, depending on how your model is going to be used, adding these extra little bolts may not be completely necessary. In this case, I thought it would add a little bit more realism, especially because we want to have some up-close renders. So I'm going to go ahead and add a sphere. We can just bring down those subdivisions so it's really low in polys. I can chop it in half, and then I can start positioning those exactly where I want them on my model. And I also just did a quick UV on that first bolt just so I didn't have to come redo my work. So all I did was a planar projection, and then I just Control U to unfold, Control L to lay it out, and now it's prepped ahead of time, so when I start duplicating all the other screws, they're already all UV'd. Alright, and just like that, we are done all of the modeling. So now let's jump over to the UVing process so we can start UVing all of these objects. And really quickly, I just want to mention, since it's relatively high in polys right now, I do at the end of the UVing go over how I would do other versions of chords, and I actually bring down the current one, just reduce some of the polys, so it's like half the amount of polys later on. Now the model itself actually hits our target. It's around 4,000-ish, 4,500 with those screws, and then the chord itself adds on like an extra 6,000 polys or something. So let's just go into the UVing and then we can jump back to that chord at the end. Alright, so to start things off, I'm going to select all of the objects and delete history. And then I'm going to go in and just remove my two curves that we created earlier. So starting off with our first shape, I'm going to go in with my multi-cut tool and I'm going to make sure that there's no faces that are more than 4 sides. So I'm just going to attach some vertices where I need them and make sure the object itself is good to go before I start UVing. Alright, so I'm going to go open up my UV editor, and I can go under my UV tab and do a camera-based projection. That way I can remove all of my cuts on my model. So using my 3D cut and sew UV tool, I'm going to start making some cuts on those edges. So when I go over to my UV editor and I highlight those shells and I go Control U, you can see that they don't unfold properly, and that's just because I didn't freeze my transformations. So I'm going to delete history, freeze transformation, center pivot, and then when I unfold it properly, the shape actually goes to its correct size. And then it's just a matter of repositioning these shells on my UV map depending on how big I want those. But for now, I'm just going to move those to the side. I can move on to my next shape, and then we can come back to positioning these shells on my UV map once all the UVing is all done. So for the rest of the UVing process, it's going to be the exact same thing for every shape. I'm going to start off with deleting history, freeze transformations, and center pivots, so all that history is removed. And then I can go in with that multi-cut tool and start attaching vertices so I have no faces that are more than 4 sides. And once the shape is looking good, I can then UV it. So I can start off with doing a camera-based projection to remove all those cuts. I can go use my 3D cut and sew UV tool to start creating cuts wherever I need them, usually along edges. And then I can go to my UV editor, highlight those shells, Control U to unfold, Control L to lay them out, and then I can change the rotation of those shells so they're nice and straight, and then I can start positioning those later on once we're done all of the UVing. So let's go ahead and start UVing the rest of these shapes. I'm going to let it play out, there's no point in me explaining the exact same thing over and over again, and then I'll jump back in when all the UVing is done. Oh yeah, one quick thing about this shape specifically, I end up changing it later on because I end up doing 2 cuts around both of those edges, and you get those extra UV shells on your UV map, and they're a weird shape and it's just unnecessary. So what I end up doing is just removing one of those cuts. That way, it's basically just 2 UV shells and it looks much better. And same thing here with this shape. I actually come back and fix this as well because those little lines and little UV shells are unnecessary. You can just save yourself that UV space and basically remove one of those UV cuts and just have 2 solid UV shells.
Check it out. Check it. Check. Check it out. Check it.
Alright, so once I wrap up all those UVs, I'm going to start grouping together all the objects I know are the same. So for example, those bolts share the exact same UV space, and they're also the exact same models. So I can group those all together, I can select those shells and move them to the side. That way I can just avoid accidentally laying them all out, and I want to keep them stacked on top of each other to save that UV space. So let's go ahead and start grouping up these objects so I can start planning out how I'm going to lay out these UVs. Alright, so now that all those objects that are sharing the same UV space are pushed to the side, I basically want to lay out all my other single objects. So I'm just going to move over all the sweep meshes since they're already laid out, basically taking up the full length in my one-to-one space. So I'm going to push those to the side, select all the other objects, and I can Control L to lay them out. Then I can go select all my sweep meshes and I can start positioning them to fit in the empty space in my UV map. So it's a really good habit to straighten your UV shells when you can, and that top sweep mesh is clearly bent. So we're going to go over to our UV toolkit. Under the Unfold drop-down menu, we're going to go select Straighten UVs. And that's just basically going to straighten that shell so it's nice and straight. And I'm actually really quickly going to go ahead and straighten all of these shells. And now that those shells are all straight, I can fit them much better on my UV map. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and speed up this next little part just because I went ahead and started laying out all of these UVs and I forgot to freeze my transformations on some of these shapes. So when I go Control L and lay everything out, it doesn't actually give priority to the larger objects in my scene. So I have to go back and Control Z a bunch of stuff and then basically select all of my objects, go delete history, freeze transformations. And then when I lay them out, all the objects look correct and those UV shells are taking up the correct space in my 0 to 1 space in my UV editor. So rather than wasting your time, I'm just going to speed it up a little bit until I Control Z everything and I do it properly. Also, something I forgot to mention that's pretty important for game assets is combining all of these objects together. Really, anything that isn't animated or that you're planning to move around down the road, I would combine into one object. And there's many reasons for it, but it's definitely something that you should do. Now this is something that I wait usually until the very end, as I find keeping them separate allows you to individually select those objects, and it's easier to UV and deal with the shapes until you're happy with it. And then at the very end, you can just select all of those objects and then go mesh combine. And keep in mind, it's always undoable. You can go mesh separate and then reattach or recombine the objects that you want, but it's definitely something you should get in the habit of doing. Alright, so all of those UVs are all laid out on my UV map, and I go back and actually adjust a few things. I didn't like those edges, how I made extra cuts and have some weird shapes, so I go back and adjust a few things, which I'll show you in a little bit. But really quickly, I want to go over exactly how I would do those extra chords. And as you can see right now, I have like 30,000-ish polys, and it's relatively high. This is definitely not optimized for a video game, especially a little iron like this. So what we're going to do is just duplicate it over, and I can show you a few different things I would do to this chord. Alright, so one quick thing you could do is just make a shorter chord. Rather than having it wrap all the way around the handle, you could just make a really small EP curve tool like this, just hanging out the back, and that way you're saving on tons of polys in your scene. So making these small little changes can really make a big impact with how many polys you have in your scene. So if I was going to do something this small, I would just make some little small bevels in some of these harsh corners, especially if you're going to be up close, and even that may not be necessary. You can make it really, really low if you really wanted. And as you can see, that small little chord we just created is around 700 polys, whereas the other one's upwards of 13,000 polys. So making these small little changes can go a long way. So another thing you can do is just reduce polys. So I took that first object, which was around 20,000 polys that I have selected here, and I duplicated it over, and I just reduced that chord and I cut it in half. This one's around 10,000 polys. And this is actually the chord that I end up rendering with. The higher poly one was a little bit unnecessary, especially if I isolate them, they look almost identical. And obviously if you look really close, you can see some harder edges, but having a high poly chord like that is not really necessary unless it's just specifically for high poly renders. And same with this back piece right here, I ended up just reducing it a little bit. I brought down around 1,000 polys-ish, and they look basically identical. So making these small little changes can really go a long way with how many polys you have in your scene. Another small thing I did was just cut off the bottom of those screws that are holding that handle. So I ended up going with this other iron that we created, the lower poly one. It's a little bit closer. I think 10,000 polys is pretty reasonable, mostly because I want some nice close-up renders, and honestly I just really wanted that chord wrapped around that handle. And to be honest, the iron itself is only 4,000, so it's really the chord and the back metal spiral that's adding an extra 6,000-ish polys to the scene. So keep that in mind. You could always design your chord in a different way, and you can cut back on tons of polys. So now that the model's looking a little bit better and we've cut those polys by more than half, we are ready to jump into Substance so we can start texturing. Alright, so now in Substance Painter I can load in my FBX file from Maya. And if that's looking good, you can go over to your texture set settings, scroll down to Bake Mesh Maps, and you can choose your output size. So I chose 4K, and make sure to check on that use low poly mesh as high poly mesh, since we only have one mesh to work with. Now I chose 4K for my texture size just because I want those nice close-up renders. Just keep in mind that your texture size is going to play a big role in how your model is used. Now it's usually easier to downsize a texture than it is to upscale, so keep that in mind. I usually like to just export around 4K, and then inside of the engine that I'm using I can just set that resolution to whatever I need. So now we're ready to texture. So I'm just going to start looking for a base material for this iron. So I'm going to go over to my Smart Materials tab, and I'm going to go choose the Steel Stain texture as the base. I can open up that folder and start tweaking some of the roughness values and the luminosity just to make it a little bit brighter or darker depending on how I want it to look. And once that's looking good, I want to add a little bit of dirt or grunge effect on top of this. So I'm going to go ahead and add a fill layer, and then I can go over to my masks tab and I can go choose whatever mask effect I want to throw onto this fill layer, just to add that grunginess on top of my material. And then it's just a matter of playing around with these settings, so dragging that balance slider to show how much of that dirt or grunge effect we want to show, and then changing the color to something that suits the model a little bit better. So I'm going to do the exact same thing once again and add another fill layer so I can add some more dirt or grunge on top of this. What I'm doing is basically working really slowly, and I want to add these layers, and I find the more layers you add, different colors and materials, it slowly starts to look more realistic. So let's go ahead and start adding some more dirt and grunge effects. Also, you should definitely name your folders. I'm just not going to in this video just so it makes it easier for you guys to see exactly what materials I have applied. But it's definitely a good habit to get into. And once I'm happy with how everything's looking, I can right click that folder, set that to a black mask, and then using my polygon fill, I can just fill in whatever meshes I want to assign that material to. What I then noticed is that last fill layer I adding all those little drip effects, I don't want them showing on that bottom piece of metal, I just want it on the top piece. So what I'm going to do is just add an empty folder. I can throw that fill layer inside of that folder, and I can assign that folder to a black mask, and then specifically just assign it to that one top mesh so the bottom doesn't have those dripping effects on them. Alright, so now that's looking much better. So I want to continue adding some more effects. I want to add a little bit of rust. So I'm going to add a fill layer, I'm going to switch that to a black mask. Then I can right click that once again and go down to add a generator. So I'm going to click on the generators and add this dripping rust effect. All I have to do is just change this base color so it's more of a rusty color. And then I can just drag this height slider slightly down to add a little bit of imprint into that metal. So now it looks like that rust is actually into the metal a little bit, not right directly on the surface. And then at this point, it's a matter of just messing around with these sliders. Now I don't want to show a lot of rust, so most of these sliders I'm going to put them all the way down, crank that contrast up just so it's really sharp on the edges. And there's these little tiny holes that are into the metal. It's such a small little detail, but once you start layering on these little effects, I find it starts to look quite realistic. So I really like this iron forged texture that comes with Substance Painter, and I thought it'd be fitting to add this iron material on my iron object, which would be pretty fitting. So I'm going to go over to my Smart Materials tab, I'm going to choose that iron forged material and put that right above my steel stained. All I'm going to do is open that, go directly down to that base color, and then I can go over to my Masks tab and drag on a masking effect directly onto that base color. So what that's going to do is allow that color to be a little more transparent. Since it's a mask, it's only going to show up in certain areas. So what's going to happen is I'm going to pick up all those little details we added earlier in our steel stained material, but it's also going to show all those other masking and dirt grunge effects that come inside of this iron forged folder. I just wanted to take advantage of them since I like the look, and all we have to do at this point is just play around with some of these settings depending on how much dirt and grunge we want to show. Alright, so on that bottom piece of metal, I want it to be a little more bumpy and I want it to be a little darker. Basically, very similar in materials, but clearly different than that top iron piece. So what I'm going to do is jump back to my Smart Materials folder, I'm going to go choose that iron old material, and I'm going to drag that directly above my steel stained folder. So I'm going to right click this folder, set that to a black mask, and then I can go to my polygon fill, similar to how we assigned these materials earlier, but this time I'm going to switch it to UV fill. Previously when we were doing the UV mapping, I made sure to do a cut right along this edge, so it'd be really easy to apply this material. So since it's on UV fill, I can just directly click that bottom piece and it's just going to assign it to that bottom strip. So now all I'm going to do is just tweak some of these settings like the roughness values and remove those edge markings and just play around with things until I'm happy with how it's looking. So at this point, I just want to start filling in those empty meshes that I need to apply materials to. That way it's going to help me visualize how I want this model to look and I can start tweaking things further. So I started off just by reassigning that steel stain to the handle, which I then change up later on, but for now I just want to fill in these objects. And then I can go back to my Smart Materials folder and go choose a rubber material to assign to this cord. Alright, so next up was that wood handle. So I'm going to go back to my Smart Materials folder and I'm going to go choose one of these wood materials to apply and just see how things look. But I ended up going with this wood ship hull material, and I just really liked it with those wood grains that you can see. So all I'm going to do is open up that folder, tweak some of those colors to make that wood a little bit darker, and then similar to the other metal materials earlier, I'm going to add a couple fill layers and start adding some dirt and grunge effects over top of that. Alright, so I'm pretty happy with how the wood's looking. Let's just move on to the other meshes and we can always come back. So I wanted these other metal meshes, like that piece that's holding the wire and the little metal piece that's holding that wooden handle. I wanted those to be more rusty than the other iron materials below. So I'm just going to jump back to my Smart Materials folder and I'm going to choose this steel rusted surface material to apply to those meshes. I'm then just going to go ahead and open up that folder and I can go down to that rust that's applied and just tweak some of those colors to make it more of a rust color. This is such a light gray, it doesn't really look that rusty, so I just want to be a little bit more orange and brown looking. And then once I'm happy with the color, I can go ahead and tweak some of these settings like the global balance just to see how much rust I actually want to show on the material. And then once I'm happy with that, I can right click the folder, assign it to a black mask, and then assign it to those meshes in my scene. Alright, so next up was finding some more metal materials for these last remaining pieces. So once again, going back to my Smart Materials tab, I quickly just applied this iron forged material again, just tried to experiment with some of these colors and looks. And while zooming in on this little outlet piece, I noticed how my little metal pieces that are coming out of it were bent. Basically, something on the export was messed up and I didn't look at my model clear enough when I brought it in. So I'm just going to quickly jump back into Maya so I can re-export the model properly, and I can bring it back into my scene. And since I brought it back in, I'm assuming some of those UVs probably moved, so I'm just going to rebake all these textures with the exact same settings they originally were, and then we can continue on with those materials. So the first object we're going to tackle is that little outlet piece. I'm going to go back to my Smart Materials tab, and I'm going to go choose one of those plastic used materials to assign to this mesh. All I have to do is open up that folder, tweak some of the colors. I don't want it to be a bright beige, I want it to be a dark black. And I can just turn off some of these other settings like the bumps and those white speckles that come already with this material. Alright, so next up are those little screws. Now I'm going to choose just a simple color like that steel armor, and I'm going to apply that to those meshes. Now for those little imprints and indents into those little metal screws, we're going to do that later on. I just want to continue to fill up the rest of these empty meshes first. So next up is that little metal piece that's holding that metal bar. So what I'm going to do is go back to my Smart Materials tab and I'm going to choose this steel ruin material to apply to that mesh. All I'm going to do is open up that folder. I'm going to turn off that dirt occlusion right away just because it's too much dirt and I can always add my own masks later on. And I'm just going to scroll down to the bumps and the edge highlight, and I'm going to turn both of those to more of a rusty color. Basically, I don't want to show that bright metal that's already applied to this material. I want that metal edge wear to show as some sort of rust. So let's go ahead and play around with some of these colors. And once I'm happy with how it's looking, I can right click that folder, set that to a black mask, and assign it to those meshes. Alright, so for that back little spring object, I decided just to go with one of the materials I already have applied, so I'm just going to reassign that steel stain to that back mesh. Alright, so next up were those little screws. So for these guys, I didn't want to assign the exact same rust material we have on the other ones. I wanted these screws to be a little bit different in color and also have different amounts of rust on them. So I'm just going to choose that exact same steel rusted surface material we assigned earlier, but I'm just going to reassign it to this mesh as its own material. That way I can go in and tweak these settings. It's not going to affect anything else in my model. Alright, so now that all of these meshes have materials applied, I can quickly jump back to those first ones I was working on and start tweaking some of those settings. I want to add a little bit more grunge and some more rust, so let's go ahead and start adding some more details. Alright, so I added a little bit more rust to that bottom metal piece. Now I'm going to quickly jump into the render to see how these materials are looking. So all I'm going to do here is just remove that background image and just bring up that floor height to match up relatively close to my model. I can always fix it later on, just going to help me see how things are going. And the first thing that jumped out to me was that main color on that iron piece. It was just looking too clean, and I didn't like the rust. I wanted to add more grunge and dirt effects, so using those exact same methods I just went over, I'm just going to keep adding to this material, experimenting with different materials and grunge effects until I find something that's a little bit more suitable to what I had in mind. So sometimes I find working in the editor can be a little deceiving, just because you're only working in 1K resolution. When you jump into the renderer, when it's like 4K or whatever it is, it just looks sometimes quite different. So I'm just going to go up to my texture set settings and I'm going to increase my resolution from 1K to 2K while I'm working in my editor. It's going to give me a more clear and accurate representation of what those materials are looking like while I'm working on them in the editor. So now jumping back into the renderer, I'm just going to change my environmental map just to get another look at how these materials are looking, and then I can jump back into my editor and continue making some more tweaks to these materials. Alright, so the materials are looking much better now and the iron is slowly coming together. There's still definitely some tweaking we have to do, but it's getting there. One of the things I did when I was doing the UV mapping was made sure I did some cuts along both ends of this long cord. What I wanted to do, which was also showing my reference, was having some blue pieces of tape basically on each end. So since I did those cuts, it's going to make it really easy for me to apply that material. All I have to do is just go choose a base material for that tape, and then I can right click it, and using the UV fill, I can just assign it to those two UV pieces on both ends of the cord. And all I did was just increase that height slider just a little bit, so it looks like that blue tape's a little bit higher than that other material on my cord, and then just change it to more of a blue color. So while looking at it in the renderer, I noticed how those rusty pieces of metal weren't rusty enough. I really wanted that little piece I was holding, that metal back bar, to be like really rusty. So I first started just experimenting with changing the color, but that wasn't doing it enough, so I ended up choosing the rust coarse material and then assigning it to that mesh, and then going through and adding a different grunge or dirt mask on top of that material. Alright, it was looking a little bit better, but we're still not there. Now, while I was looking at the whole object, I noticed how that first material we applied was looking a little bit too flat, and I wanted to add a little bit of bump into that metal material. So to do that, I'm going to go back to my materials folder, I'm going to choose this black grainy material, and I'm going to assign that directly below that base color in that folder that's assigned to that mesh. And that's just going to allow me to have some sort of bump effect that's below all of those metal materials. Another really easy way of doing this is just adding a fill layer and turning off all the channels so you only have the height, and then you can drag up and down the height slider depending on how much bump, and I actually end up doing that in the end. I end up removing this plastic grainy material and I just add a plain fill layer with a height channel assigned just to get that bump. And that cord was looking a little bit too plain as well, so once again I'm going to add another fill layer to that rubber material that we applied to the cord, and I can add a different masking effect just to have a little bit of dirt or some sort of different shade or color on top of that rubber. Alright, so I was pretty happy with how the model was looking, and now it was time to add some serious rust. So I'm going to go back to my materials folder, and I'm going to choose this rust fine material that comes with Substance, and then I can turn that to a black mask, go choose a certain dirt brush, or whatever brush I'd like, and start pasting on this rust right on top of all of my materials. So I'm basically just going to work off of my UV map, and I'm going to start just pasting on this rust all along those edges where my models intersect with each other. Basically where I would imagine the rust would build up from all those metals that are really tight together and all the moisture that's possibly getting in between them and all that. So I'm going to start just overly drawing it on really excessively. I always find it's a little bit easier to paint on a little bit more than what you're planning, and then you can go to your eraser brush and start pulling some of it back. And you can keep switching up your brushes between painting it on and erasing it, and I find just going between the different brushes and different colors, you start to get these really cool layers, and the more brushes you use, the more realistic it looks, so it's not one consistent style all over the model. So while taking a look in the renderer, I couldn't help but notice that wood handle. It just didn't look right to me, and I wanted to make a few small adjustments. I wanted to make those wood veins not so obvious and blend them in a little bit, and then add a little bit more extra grunge effects. So let's go ahead and add a few extra things, and then we can jump back to the rest. Alright, so we added a few extra grunge and dirt effects to the model, and it's looking a little bit better. It's looking a little bit more beaten up, which I like, but those little bolts that are holding that handle in place are looking a little bit too clean, especially those little cylinders that the screws are screwed onto. So I'm going to go ahead and assign another rust material to those specific meshes, and then I can add another masking effect over top of it to help blend it in with the metal. So for the next few minutes, I'm just going to let it play out as I'm just tweaking some colors and adding some extra grunge and dirt effects onto these materials. Basically just doing the exact same thing we've been doing the whole time, just tweaking colors and adding extra fill layers. Once we get this iron in a little bit of a better state, we can move on to a few other things. Alright, so after adding those extra little details, it's looking much better in my opinion, and we're almost done the texturing. I just want to add a nice little imprint on the very back of the iron, and then add a little word. I just went with poly render, but to do that we're going to add another fill layer, and I'm just going to turn off all the channels since we only want the height channel. I'm going to put it directly into that folder that's assigned to that metal material on my iron, and then I can go choose an alpha, one of those square rectangular alphas, and I can just make an imprint directly into that metal. And then I can do the exact same process, add another fill layer, add a height channel to it, and I can choose another alpha, just one of the fonts, and then I can imprint some letters directly into that square. So let's go ahead and just finish this little logo on the back. Alright, so for the rest of the video, I'm basically just going to continue tweaking settings and colors and adding more fill layers with more grunge and dirt effects. I kind of went a little crazy with the masks and grunge, but honestly, you could keep going all day. This is where I find the model starts really starting to look more realistic. By continuing to add these small layers and different effects, it slowly makes the model come to life. And during this next little bit, I add some really dark metallic rust right in the cracks in various random places, and I find that really helps the model look more realistic. Right now it only has one shade or tone of rust and it just doesn't look that real. So I go in and add a few different shades of orange and brown, and once you start combining these materials and textures, like I said, it just starts to make the model look way more realistic in my opinion. And like I mentioned earlier in the video, we also go add some nice indents into those screws. So I'm just going to let this video play out for the next 5 minutes or so as I just go in and add a few more details and we wrap up the rest of the texturing. And that's basically everything, guys. That's the whole modeling, UVing, and texturing process that I did to create this old USSR Iron. I really hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more weekly 3D content. And a really big shout out to Evgeny Leonov. He's the artist that created this original concept and I based basically its whole model off of, so big shout out to him for creating such an amazing piece of art. And if you'd also like to support the channel even further, as well as get access to additional content, check out my Patreon page, which is linked in the description below. Alright, thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.